on one hand, I don't think any scientist can deny that mercury is toxic. It's just not possible. That would be beyond ludicrous. But yet, they can deny that it's associated with disease. So in between that spectrum is a world of strange, illogical behavior that I'm always surprised and shocked to find people who claim to be scientists that are involved in this. But yet the charade continues, and it's a huge industry. I had a professor who will be unnamed, who was a professor of epidemiology. He worked for the CDC. He was involved in developing vaccines, and he was also a paid consultant by the vaccine company to go to court and tell people that immunoglobulin shots, which were prenatal shots containing thimerosal, mercury vaccines, were not a risk factor for disease. And when I found this out, I was a little bit surprised, because I didn't know a university professor could be paid to espouse an idea given to them by a pharmaceutical company, especially someone who worked for the CDC. But I didn't think much of it, because I didn't know if he was right or wrong. But then as I did more research, I kept on giving him papers. I was like, well, why don't you read this paper? This seems to say that there could be a subset of people that are, highly specific, in which case epidemiological evidence may not. First of all, he told me that he only looks at epidemiological evidence. He won't look at toxicology. Second of all, every time I tried to show him toxicological data that would provide a mechanism, I would tell him, look, we have these epidemiological studies that find no risk, but if there's a specific subset of people that are high risk, these studies will not find it. And he said, you're right. But we don't know if there's a subset, and we can't determine it. We can't distinguish it. So then I would give him other studies like, oh, look, this shows that mercury affects the immune system. And he would be like, yeah, okay, whatever. And I don't know if he read them or if he didn't read them. But then finally, after 3 or 4 years of work, I think it was 3 years of working on this, I finished my thesis. I got it approved by this committee who were really stringent, because they couldn't believe what I was finding. And they finally did. I mean, my committee graduated me and accepted it, but they were very stringent, and they made me do tests over and over again, redundancy after redundancy, because I was pretty much doing it on my own, and they couldn't believe I had found this out of nowhere. So I had to keep repeating it. I had a statistician professor, I had an epidemiologist professor, and I had a chemistry professor, and they would all constantly grill me for 3 years. It's supposed to take 2 years. It took me 3 years. And finally I'm done, and I have this thesis, and this thesis not only shows that the risk may be growing because exposure is growing, but it could be a huge public health risk. And if the background exposure is growing, if we have more mercury in our bodies, then any added mercury could be a potential risk for disease. So even though maybe the thimerosal wasn't a problem in the 1980s or 1970s when it was less and we had less background, but now that we have more in our body, any added exposure from dental amalgams or for thimerosal is even more critical, because it could make us pass this toxic threshold. So I was pretty alarmed, actually, when I finished my thesis, and I gave him this thesis. I was like, you have to read this. This may change your mind. I really thought, and he was like, I'm not going to read this. I have important things to do. So here's a guy who is a position of great power in the government, in the vaccine industry, in academia. He's, I think, the head of epidemiological society for the world or something, in America right now. He's very powerful, very influential, and he won't even open his mind to information that counters his opinion, his set way. So that, to me, is unheard of in scientific circles, in academia, that someone would not only not read something, but dismiss it as unworthy of reading before he even read it. I mean, I can imagine he read it and said it's unworthy, that's one thing, but to say it's unworthy without even reading it, I mean, that's just not scientific, and it's not responsible when you're in a position of authority who has the authority to, and the influence to be able to change this, to deny due process to new research, new information, you know? So this was shocking to me. It's shocking, but it was only the beginning. When I started looking into, you know, some of the research that was being published that was flawed, and the response of the mass media, it's a huge issue. Exposure from dental amalgam, you know, especially if you have significant amounts of them, has been demonstrated to be a problem. In fact, I had a professor who was on my advising committee at Berkeley, Dr. Michael Bates. He did a study in Australia, the largest cohort to date on dental amalgams. A lot of people don't know about this study, but he looked at the surface size and amalgam numbers, and it was an adult population. I think it was mostly soldiers in Australia, or was it New Zealand? One of the two. And it was a huge cohort, and he found an association between dental amalgams and a risk for multiple sclerosis in the adult population. And it wasn't an old population. They were like soldiers just off service in their 30s. So because the population was a certain age, you couldn't look at really prolonged exposure that the elderly are subjected to, or the effects on the very sensitive biological responses of the young. But even in this age, where you wouldn't expect morbidity, he found an elevated risk for multiple sclerosis with dental amalgams. So the risk from these amalgams is really troubling, to say the least. And when he actually applied to the NIH to extend this study, he was denied. Even though it was the largest cohort, he wanted to extend it into later ages to see if it was related to neurodegenerative disease. And it's funny because when he was applying, I was like, you know, you're not going to get this because it's not a scientific issue, it's a political issue. And he thought I was making it up. It seems obvious to researchers in the field that it's a growing health risk that needs to be addressed. Not only that, it's a political issue that is being stymied. So without a change in the political environment, science and the human health is really at risk. I believe that, and that's why I don't want to work on it anymore. I want to do something fun like cancer research. And it's so hysterical comparing the two fields. I mean, in cancer you could find the smallest, oddest association in a genetic screen or expression screen, and people will treat it like a gem, like, oh, maybe this will be something meaningful. Whereas in Mercury, you can come up with a beautiful study showing something really significant, and it will be treated like trash. No one will even publish it.